First off, we'll just be recording everything for those that can't make it. It'll just be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. But yeah, we'll start off with Reuben, if you want to introduce yourself, what you do, and all of that. Take it away.
Hold on, I'm just going to turn on my light. It's slightly dark in here.
Yeah, that's all good.
Sorry, didn't realize it was so dark. Hi everyone, I'm Reuben. I'm the director of Noble Steed Games, which, if you're not familiar, is a game studio based here in Sydney. So we do all kinds of things. We make games that you traditionally think of as like what a game studio does, e.g. games for consumers. But we're also a service provider, which means we make games for companies outside of video games that are looking to use games or kind of adjacent technologies for things. So things like AR is a pretty common example. A lot of companies want to try and use AR for or gamified systems for kind of training or things like that. And we help companies who don't know anything about games kind of get into the space. And we also help other small game studios with specific things. So if they need specific technical expertise, often things like porting for console platforms or multiplayer networking, that's something that we do as well. So we kind of do all kinds of things, which is a kind of a fun situation to be in. My guiding principle has always just been working on projects that I personally think are fun. And there's enough of those out there. Games is enough of a space where there are lots of fun things to work on. That means we've worked on a whole variety of things, from like mobile games, arcade cabinets, to kind of traditional, what you might think of as educational games, console porting, multiplayer networking for bigger studios, all kinds of things. So yeah, we're a fun small company, just fun to work on a bunch of different projects. So that's a bit of an intro to us. We also do kind of events and general things around Sydney. So if you're familiar with things like Whip Nights, we put those on. Or we've been running an event called Games Exchange. There is another one of those on this Friday. And yeah, so if you want to get more involved with events around Sydney, you can check out our socials, our Blue Sky, whatever, and see some of the events we're putting on there. But yeah, that's me. That's Noble Steed.
Cool. All right, so if you go to the verified stage chat, I'll just be posting questions there. If anyone has questions they want to be answered later, feel free to just put them in the chat as well, and we'll go through them. But the first question is from Tash9580. I think they're here, right? Yana? Yeah. So the question is, what's something you wish you knew when you were my age that would have made your journey in the industry easier?
Well, I don't know your specific age, but I'm just going to assume university age. Yeah. Look, I think games is an interesting industry to be in. It's a tough industry to be in a lot of ways, right? So that comes with challenges. I think anyone who's keeping up with games media knows what the challenges look like. Studios shutting down, there not being enough work, those types of things. But it also comes with advantages, right? Which are maybe harder to see. I think one of those advantages is that a lot of people have very strange paths into the games industry and are therefore very accepting of strange paths into the games industry. I think you hear a lot about people in games who have found very weird paths to end up being game designers or programmers or having a lot of cross-disciplinary skills. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths of the games industry, is because it is a creative field. You can excel based on the strength of other skills outside of just game making. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think that's probably a piece of advice I would always give to people starting their journey into the games industry. Being good from a technical perspective at making games, whatever that field is that you've kind of chosen, programming, art, whatever. That's one thing, but something that will really set you apart and be valuable and be valued when people are looking at you as a potential employee or collaborator or whatever it is a breadth of experiences that will let you flex kind of creativity and come up with things that are interesting and new and unique. I think that's mostly true, or that's especially true for designing, if you want to get into design at all. But especially in Australia, where it's a small industry, people in games teams wear a lot of hats. We're a 5-person company, which means we don't have a dedicated designer. Basically, everyone on the team picks up design as they see it as being appropriate. And that means when I'm hiring for any role, I'm looking for somebody that is at least somewhat creative and has kind of a breadth of interests that lends to them having more experiences. So to bring it back to the question, some advice that I would have given myself when I was younger, and that I would give to anyone else starting out in their journey into the games industry, is be proud of and value your diverse interests and hobbies and experiences, because they will lend to making cooler things, and that's really valuable when you're working on games, when you're a part of a team in games.
Hope that answers your question, Yana. Just double checking that.
I can see typing. If there's any follow-up questions, of course, feel free to pop it in.
Yep, cool. All right, next question. This is from Bito. With you running a consultancy program as part of your services in Noble Steed, what aspects of a project do you consider when looking into or accepting a contract? Are
Mm.
there potential obstacles or pitfalls that you look ahead for when being presented a project?
Yeah, totally. I'll answer the specifics of the question, but then I'll kind of give some caveats. I think, because I think there's more to talk about this question. There are definitely pitfalls to look into when being presented with a potential project to work on. The one that I see the most is for people who are outside the games industry and don't have a real picture of what games looks like. Um, Not having a clear goal or something clear that they're looking to make. I suppose they have a kind of idea, right? And those ideas can be as vague as, oh, we want to make a Pokemon Go, but instead of Pokemon, it's blank, right? That's one that I've heard a few times. Um, and that's a good starting point. But the thing that leads to success in projects and in games projects specifically is being able to conceptualize the entirety of what something's going to look like. So being able to imagine, okay, here's how the UI is going to work. Here is how what the tutorial for new players will look like. Here's the specific mechanics that we want to implement. That's something that I notice a lot with people who are outside of games and coming to us to help them build projects. And I see as a core part of my job is helping them understand, hey, you said you want, let's say, Pokemon Go, but with something other than Pokemon, let's say with trucks, right? But what does that actually mean in this circumstance? What do you want to do in this? What does the main menu UI look like, and what happens if a player clicks on this part? So that's one of the biggest pitfalls, and I think kind of to generalize that into advice that is maybe more appropriate to you all that are kind of at least on your game development journey, I would say it's very easy to get excited by an idea, and that is good. Like, something that will lead to a project being successful is if you're excited by the idea that you're building. But do try and kind of envisage the entirety of a game so that you know what potential problems you're going to run into when you start making it. You know, energy put into planning saves, 10 times that amount of energy later on down the line, and you'll, I'm sure, as you'll work on projects, even just the student projects at UTS, you'll have run into this already, and that's a lifelong lesson to learn, is like how, how to know what a project will end up looking like, and how to figure that out before you build it. It's very difficult, and it's a skill that you'll kind of have to keep practicing. But yeah, that's something that I would kind of encourage. Uh, from a consultancy perspective of like, what aspects of a project do we look into? It does kind of depend on the project. Um, yeah, that's from that answer often is what I just talked about, is from people coming outside of games to get into the games industry. To give a different answer, when we're looking at getting involved with games projects, I think the thing that helps me determine whether I think a project will be successful, of course, there's like mechanical interest and things like that, but the passion of the key creative team members is something that I think is more important than, yeah, I think more important than any other factor as to whether a project will be a success or not. Because games are a lot of work to make, and it can be very easy to lose energy for making a game, and so you kind of need to have that passion to help you push through it. Whether you're doing it like paid to be doing it or not, it can be very easy to kind of lose sight or lose focus or lose passion and have that really impact the project that you're working on. So that's something that I look at when I'm working with other game studios, is what's the part of this game that is really exciting to these people, so that we can kind of help support that part of the game and bring the kind of joy of the game that they're envisaging to life. Um, so yeah, that's I guess a few different answers based on different types of projects, but hopefully useful advice to be found within there.
Yep, cool. I don't believe he's in call right now, so we'll move on to the next question. So the next one is from Stephen. What were some of the biggest challenges in transitioning from Nomos to Noble Steed?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll give more background of what that means if people aren't aware of our corporate history, I suppose. Which is that when we started, we were kind of a sub branch of a bigger organization, Nomos. We started under as kind of a wing of their organization called Nomos Studios, doing games consulting and games development. And as we kind of grew and picked up more clients, we decided to properly branch out into our own identity. Honestly, while there were kind of minor challenges along the way, things like what do we decide on what our company's name is going to be, things like that, those really were more opportunities than they were challenges in any real way. I mean, like, it was actually a lot of fun to ask the questions around, okay, what are the core things that we think define our identity? And then just, chuck a bunch of words at the wall and see which ones we liked, right? Uh, and I'm happy to, if people are interested, I'm happy to talk in more detail about why we landed on Noble Steed Games as a company name, if people would find that interesting. But yeah, I think while there were some minor challenges of just how do we set up a business, how do we kind of do some of these bits and pieces, it's exciting, right? It's exciting to be defining an identity. So there was nothing that was super concerning. I think a lot of things you can just kind of figure out along the way if you're have people that are kind of passionate and interested and keen on working together. That covers a lot of bases. I see someone has mentioned they are interested in why we landed on Noble Steed Games, so I'll talk about that a bit more. When we were talking about what defines our identity as a studio, I think some of the key things that we kept coming back to were just an eagerness and a willingness to be a supporter of all the companies that we worked with. Specifically, this vision of uh, a noble steed as a kind of compatriot on your journey, right? Somebody that's there to help get you from point A to B, or is there for some or all of your journey along development of your game, supporting you, being a champion beside you, and kind of helping you be the hero of the story, I guess. And I think that's a role that we're very happy to slot into, is this idea of being a trusted ally and supporter. We started using the tagline "Your game's best friend," which I think is a very fun summation of how we try and think of ourselves and how we try and act in the industry. Just here to be a friend to all the companies that we can and support the industry as best we can. And so that's what led to Noble Steed Games. There were some like names that we kind of thought about of like, oh, I can't remember all of them, but things like Vanguard or like Protector or ones that we ended up discarding because they felt like they had a bit too much like militaristic vibes, things like that. And we ended up just landing on Noble Steed Games in part because we like horses and it's kind of fun to be able to have cute horse logos and things like that. But also because we feel like it sums up quite nicely the idea of, yeah, being a supporter and a trusted ally in the somewhat daunting adventure of creating games. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. Next question is from Ben. Out of all the services you offer, are there particular ones that get more business than others? Are there services you focus on more than others as well?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it is quite um, varied. I think it just changes over time, really. I said in my introduction that one of my guiding principles has been working on things that are interesting to me personally. And I think because of that, there are kind of waves of different types of things that we'll go through. And I'm not necessarily sure how much I would ascribe that to my own interests shifting over time and how much I would ascribe that to the market shifting over time. To use an example of porting services, that's something that we've done pretty consistently for the past 2 or 3 years. But there isn't necessarily enough porting work to sustain our studio entirely within our clientele of basically Australian indie studios or kind of small to medium sized studios. Um, so there's a little bit of market meaning that we have to do different things, and there's a little bit of me just after we've done a type of project for a year or two, I start to think, okay, well, we've done that. I'm like keen on that. We've done it. Now let's try and see what the next thing that we can do is. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say there's like a specific type of project that gets more business than others permanently, it just changes a lot. I think the games industry really is a rapid industry, like a rapidly changing industry. Um, and us as a consultancy business, we're very vulnerable to shifts in the general market, right? If as it is now, a lot of studios are kind of getting smaller, and that means there's a lot of talented people out there that are looking for work, which means it's kind of harder for us in the market because our service is kind of often jumping in and doing work that other studios can't find people to do, especially on a short-term basis. Um, so yeah, we kind of have to be a bit reactive to the market, and that means I don't think there's any particular services that stick around for a huge amount of time. It's all kind of cyclical and yeah, seasonal.
Okay, hope that answers your question, Ben. Just double checking if it does.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
All right. Next question is from myself, actually. But what led you to start Noble Steed, and what were the biggest challenges you faced during its early phases?
Mm-hmm. Um, Hmm. What led me to start Noble Steed Games is probably the same reason a lot of folks are in games. It's just that it's what I wanted to do, like uh I guess to be more specific, after I had finished my degree and after doing my degree actually I found work doing Unity in AR pretty quickly, because that was still very much growing. I think it's still growing a bit, but it was it was the AI of its day, whatever, 10 years ago, right? So I was doing that for a while. That was working in Unity, and then kind of got a bit burnt out of the tech company lifestyle and wanted to get more into games. Um, and did that by working on my own hobby projects, but then, of course, needed to work on things that would earn me money as well. So started doing consulting work kind of individually. And just over time picked up more and more projects that meant we needed to kind of grow into an organization to be able to handle them. Um, so um, the reason that I started Noble Steed Games really is just I wanted to make cool games and work on cool projects. And I've been very lucky to be able to get a job for the past 8 years that is doing that. What were the biggest challenges? I think running a business is challenging and stressful in the ways that running any kind of team are. You have to worry about payroll and all kinds of things that are um, stressful to worry about. In terms of challenges, though, yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges to me personally was that I'm just not a. I don't think of myself, and maybe everyone thinks of themselves this way. I don't think of myself really as a person who's very naturally suited to like networking, which I think in an industry as small as games you kind of have to be to an extent, which I find personally quite challenging. Whenever I go to games events, I have to kind of set objectives for myself of, okay, I'm going to talk to X new people, or I'm going to try and have X different types of conversations so I can. I guess it's just me gamifying little social interactions for myself to help incentivize me. Um, and I think that's probably, if you, like me, think of yourself as someone who's not naturally into networking, probably something that you'll have to learn to do as well, because it is pretty necessary in the industry. Um, so I guess that's one of the biggest personal challenges I've had. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is from Nick. As a consultant, you offer your services on games that are not originally your own. When you are hired and provide your services and advice, what does that power and creative dynamic look like? Has there ever been serious conflicts?
Um, interesting question. So yeah, we offer our services on games that aren't ours. When we're hired, I mean, yeah. So obviously, people are paying us to work on their games, right? And that means it is potentially a slightly different dynamic than if I'm just like a creative collaborator in the purest sense, where I'm going whatever 50-50 with somebody that I'm making a game with. Of course, it's slightly different, but I think there haven't been any serious conflicts, or none that I think are irresolvable, and I think that's because you know we're we're there to help achieve an objective, and that objective is to make the best possible version of a game. And I think when we work with clients who don't have expertise in games, they recognize they've come to us for that expertise, so they will hear us out if we say, hey, we think we should do something this way instead of that way. If we're working with a client that is inside of games, they've come to us for a reason, right? And it's up to us to ensure that we're kind of working with them to help deliver the best version of a project, whether that's helping within a set of technical expertise and then lending our technical expertise to the specific area they're looking for, or if it's like us stepping outside of that bounds and trying to provide advice on other parts of the game so that we can help make it as good as possible. I think if we push for an idea that we think will work and they say no a few times, they've said no a few times, like we've kind of told them what we think is the right decision and they've decided to do something else, that's fine. That's up to them. I wouldn't recommend continuing to push something, even if I do think it's the right decision. You kind of always have to pick your battles on some things, right? So yeah, we provide advice both kind of within the areas that we're hired for and often outside of that as well. If we're hired to do like porting, often for small teams, we'll often be doing kind of general design advice stuff and technical advice stuff outside of that too. And usually people are receptive. I don't think there's ever been serious conflict because I think we're all aligned on we're trying to make the best possible version of a game, and clients that we work with can kind of recognize we're aligned on that goal and we want to help make that goal reality. And if we have different visions sometimes about what we need to do, then it's about compromise to get to that point. So yeah, nothing that's irresolvable really.
All right. Hope that answers your question, Nicholas. All right. Okay. Next question is from Yana. How do you balance creative freedom with financial sustainability in indie game developments?
That is a tough question, right? I mean, that is the question really. And if I don't think there's a necessarily a simple and clean answer to that. I think for us, the practical answer to that is that we treat our kind of internal creative projects, we try to treat them at least as though we would treat a client project, which means kind of having clear budgets for them, making sure that we're doing proper production processes on them, treating them with the high level of care that we treat client projects. And yeah, I guess the practical answer to it is we can't always work on creative projects because we do have to work on projects as an organization that keep the organization humming along, and like funded, right? So there is a trade-off between things that we would want to work on our own projects and external projects. Having said that, I don't think it's ever the case that we're working on projects that aren't at least somewhat interesting to us. I think it's pretty rare, even in the most dry technical aspects of projects, it's pretty rare that there isn't something where we can practice our creativity. And I'm a programmer by trade, which I think can be dry if you're not engaged with what it is. But it is like creative problem solving often. So while I do love to work on my own projects and our own projects as a studio, there's always something creatively fulfilling to find in the work that we're doing with clients as well. So it's not like we're uh, trudging to work in a horrible, gloomy mood because we have to work on a project for money instead of for our soul, right? But yeah, so I guess to bring it back to the question, yeah, it is a balance, and when we decide to before we decide to work on one of our own internal projects, it's a conversation about, okay, we're going to work on this project for, let's say, 4 months. Do we have the amount of money that will require for us to do that? If not, we just can't do it, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing, as I said, because there are always fun things to find in any project that we work on. The projects that we work on are somebody's passion project, and we're usually able to get excited by their passion enough to enjoy working on the project as well.
I think Yana's just typing something.
Yeah, it shifts over time. Sorry, so the question was, would there be a ratio on the projects that aren't creative projects? The framing I use to refer to them, for the reasons that I said, I feel like every project that we work on is at least somewhat a creative project. Um, the framework that I use to refer to our projects is internal versus non-internal. Oh, sorry, but it looks like the question you're asking is, are there more creative projects than mundane projects? I guess there is a scale, right? I think the least creative work that we do sometimes is porting work, because that is, we're coming in with a clear technical objective, which is get a game that already exists, or mostly exists, and bring it to a new platform. So that is the type of project that we work on that probably has the lowest amount of new things to create from like a numbers perspective. But even there are things to improve on. A lot of the types of porting projects that we work on are with small indie teams. And so they're often pretty receptive to, hey, we've noticed that there's this gameplay problem with this thing that they might not have noticed because they're a small team and they don't have QA, or they just haven't had time to fix it. So we're kind of helping improve the game as we're working on it there. Or even things like on platform, there are specific things that are required sometimes, whether it's things like achievements, or on PlayStation, it's called activities. So even these like technical limitations for things that we have to build in do sometimes have opportunities for creativity and, okay, how can we make the achievements really fun to collect in this game, right? So yeah, there is a ratio of like more to less creativity in a project, but I think there's always interesting things to find and kind of get invested into. Um, yeah, I don't know how to put that into a ratio though. There's a scale. There's definitely a scale that exists.
Okay. Next question is from Morel again. So, what would you say was the coolest project to assist with as part of Noble Steed? What sets it apart from other projects, and what did your team take from it?
Hmm. Interesting. I think there it's hard because honestly it is like, as I said, there's a lot of really fun projects that we've worked on. Almost every project that we work on, I think, is, I find personally very fulfilling to have been a part of. Which maybe feels like a cop out, but it is true. But I think there are ones that when if someone asked me, yeah, what's the coolest project you worked on? I think there are ones that have jumped to mind. And interestingly, they're not the ones that have been the most financially successful by any means, which I don't know what to take from it. I guess just take from what you will. Um, but yeah, one would be we worked on a game called Beam Team that we released to Itch. This was well early on as a studio. So this was a project we had worked on as an internal project. We kind of took it to PAX and showed it off a bit, and were approached by a company called LAI Games, who are under the same parent company that owns Time Zones, so like arcades that you'd see like near the cinema, I guess. They approached us because they were at PAX Australia looking for indie games that they thought might be a good fit to turn into arcade cabinets. So they were working with us and one other game developer to turn. They asked us if we wanted to turn our game into an arcade cabinet, and we said yes. And that was a very fun thing to work on, mainly because it was so different to anything we'd worked on before. Taking this game that we made to work with like controller or mouse and keyboard, and adapting it so it used a big steering wheel, adding kind of uh, different progression mechanics so that you could play by inserting coins or whatever, and simplifying the game's tutorials a lot, kind of changing the way that the structure of it worked. Yeah, it was really fun. And we ended up getting one of the cabinets in the end, that had gone to Perth, and the owner was selling it off, and we were like, yeah, we'll buy this. which sat in my parents' house for a while as just entertainment to people that would come over to their place. So that was a project that was really cool. I think just saying, "Hey, I worked in an arcade cabinet," and being able to point to pictures of this giant flashing machine was very fun. We had one PAX where we brought it to PAX, and people were lining up for ages to play it. I think there's just something inherently attractive about a arcade cabinet in that way. People were lining up just to play it again and again and again. So that was very cool. One of the so what set that project apart from other projects is a purely platform based thing of it's cool to have an arcade cabinet that we made. Um, uh, One other example that was one of my favorite or one of the coolest projects in my opinion that we worked on was we were approached by the IP holder behind Sea Monkeys, which if you're not familiar are like a kind of a little aquatic pet that's like brine shrimp that you put in plastic aquariums and they grow from just being little specks to being slightly bigger specks, I guess. Um, that was something that I had kind of grown up with a bit. And so when we got the opportunity to work with them on developing a mobile game that was, you know, a kind of virtual aquarium type game where you raised these 3D cartoon sea monkeys, that was very cool. That one was cool because we've worked on a lot of indie games and sometimes people know them, but oftentimes if somebody says to me at a party or whatever, "Oh, you work in games, have you worked on anything that I would know?" The answer to that realistically sometimes is no, and that's a bummer. But if I could say, "Oh, hey, yeah, we worked on the official Sea Monkeys game," a lot of people know Sea Monkeys, so that was pretty fun to have that in my pocket. Um, what set that one apart was that was one of the few. We've worked on a few, but that was one of the first IP-based games that we had worked on, and it's a big enough IP that people recognize it. I think that was really interesting to work on. It brought a lot of challenges, meaning that we had to be very careful with our representation of sea monkeys, and they had brand guidelines that we had to work with, which was not something we had necessarily really done before. So it had challenges and points of interest as well that came from it. But it was very cool just to do from a check it off the bucket list perspective, I suppose. Plus, we got sent a bunch of sea monkeys merch, which was very fun as well. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is from Stephen. What are the key challenges of running an indie studio in Australia?
Um, there are a lot of challenges. I mean, you know, Australia, especially in Sydney, we're a small industry. So, you know, I could name, I think there's not many, like 5 to 10 studios that are bigger than a handful of people here in Sydney. Well, maybe 5 to 10 is a little small. It depends on what you're counting as games, because obviously there's a lot of things that are kind of games and kind of not games, technology wise. But yeah, in Sydney, we're a small industry, which means for us as a partially a services business, we have access to a smaller amount of clients in Sydney. And then, you know, Melbourne is obviously a bit further along because of the funding that they've historically had, which is turning around. But you know, still Australia is a small games scene. It's getting bigger, but it is still pretty small. So one challenge is just we're small and we're far away, right? Even far away from Perth or other parts of Australia that potentially could be markets for us as potential clients. So yeah, what that is one of the challenges. I suppose for us as service providers, a challenge that blocks us being far away is just time zones, right? They're kind of I'm taking a service provider lens to this question, but a lot of what I'm talking about does apply to just collaborating with other game studios. If you're looking to get a job remote with other studios, or needing to move to work with other studios, or just working on your own game and wanting to work with collaborators that are outside of the east coast of Australia, or our equivalent time zones, it can just be tough. There's distance, there's time, there's all these other factors, and because we're small, you kind of have to sometimes look outside of Sydney/Melbourne to find collaborators and jobs because there just aren't that many here. So yeah, I think the Australia-based challenges are that. I think there are, of course, challenges of running an indie studio that aren't specific to Australia. There is always a ticking clock of money that is always ticking down before I might have to let somebody at the studio go or something like that. And we've been lucky to avoid that for a pretty good while now. But that's always a problem. I think there's a lot of just running a small business challenges that exist. Yeah. I want to be a bit more specific, I suppose. What are some of the key challenges of running an indie studio at all? Yeah, I think I talked a bit before about the needing to kind of be finding work to keep the studio running, and that is a challenge. The challenge of having to be networking and finding projects to work on, it is tough sometimes. We found systems and solutions that work for us, but they're different to the ones that work for other companies. From my experience chatting with other service provider studios like Chaos Theory Games, for example, also in Sydney, they go about their client acquisition and business development differently to us, which I guess is good. It means that we can kind of coexist, but it also means that there are different strategies that work for different people based on what you're interested in. I think some of the people at Chaos Theory are much better at networking than I am, so I guess that just leads to different ways of working for that. So yeah, that is definitely one of the challenges. Just running a small studio and the differences in the managerial type of work that I have to be doing versus the actual working on games type of work that I often want to be doing. That's a challenge sometimes. So yeah, I guess those are some of the key challenges. I'm seeing another question in chat. Should I jump into that one or should we go through some of the other ones for now?
Feel free to answer that one.
Yeah, perfect. So in terms of practice and general and understanding development in general, would it be better for someone to start out on their own to make several projects or hop onto different projects from different companies and then start out on their own? I sometimes feel like I spend so much time working on projects for an event or different stuff that I feel like I can't start off on my own. I think the advice I would definitely stand behind for people that are looking to practice and get better at making games is make smaller games, right? I think one of the reasons why I was able to get work fairly quickly in the industry was I had a lot of experience making small things, and yeah, that just meant that I picked up a lot of skills on how to make and deliver games. So like doing game jams, obviously student projects is a good start, but doing things like game jams or just working on your own small games, it's really hard to quantify. I think this advice is maybe overlooked by people that it's given to often because it doesn't seem very specific, but there are a lot of skills that come from game development that you don't really think about until you're actually making and delivering something. Obviously, the aspects of making a game and making a game fun are the kinds of things that people getting into game development think about, but things like, what does it look like for me to make a game accessible to people? What does it look like for me to respond to user feedback to make my game better? Or what does it look like for me to release a game and then need to be up for a week because there are bugs that I have to be fixing? Someone's commented, hey, this game doesn't work. What the hell do I do? Like, there are a lot of things that you don't really learn until you run up against them. And the best way to run up against them is just by making and releasing a lot of little things. And that has the benefit, obviously, of giving you practice of developing different types of games, right? If you work on one project for 10 years, you're only going to learn how to make that type of thing. And that's good if you can find a job doing that specific type of game, but it also is very limiting in the variety of things you can point to. If someone says to you, hey, have you ever worked on a driving game before? And you've spent 10 years working on an RPG, the answer is just no, right? But if you can point to, oh yeah, I did that. It was a small project, but I did that, and people played it. And I'll send you a link to it. Like, that is a much better answer. So to give more practical examples like that of why you should work on a lot of small things, it just isn't a good thing to be doing. Yeah. I also got the advice of work on a lot of small things, and I partially listened to it and partially rejected it. So I'm trying to give you my version of that advice. So this is a great question from Yana. So it's better to be a jack of all trades, a master of none? No, I don't think that's the case, but I do think that's the case when you're starting out, because realistically, you're not going to be you can't be a master of anything until you've kind of gotten employed doing that thing or made money doing that thing, right? And to get to that point, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades. So that's taking a very like how to get a career in games focus. But to give it another lens, I, for a long time, thought I wouldn't want to run a game studio. I thought some of the work that I would hate would be like needing to manage people. And it wasn't until I actually started to do it that I realized there's something really great about finding people that I think are talented and have had difficulty getting into the games industry and giving them opportunities and space and direction that they need to grow, and then they can go off and just be in the industry, you know. That's something that I wouldn't have thought of that I would do in my career, but it's kind of happened just because I've done stuff. I've kind of taken opportunities and tried to chase them down. So I think often it is the case that you just don't. I kind of hate that I'm about to say this, so I'll apologize in advance. You don't necessarily know what you're going to want in 5 years, right? Like, you it you might think that you do. I've definitely thought that I did, but things change. Like the world changes and your desires change, and it's better for you to have a breadth of things to fall back on to then kind of chase down further if you find that they're things that you actually do enjoy. You might, you might find something that you like more than what you think you were going to do for your entire life, and that's okay. The only way to find that out is to try it, and maybe you hate it, but you'll have kind of more language from, okay, I worked on this type of game and I hate working on racing games, but at least now I know how they work a bit more, so I can articulate the types of things that I hate about them. That's a benefit as well. um so sorry, I'm just catching up on chat a little bit. Yeah, so Ben has asked, when providing services to clients, is there a reason, aside from time zone differences, for not working with people outside of Australia? It's dependent on the service you're offering, I guess, to the client. But if it's something that doesn't require constant interaction with the client, is there any downside? There are a lot of soft downsides, like time zones, that just matter more than you think they would, right? I think it's very easy to think, oh, it doesn't really matter where somebody is in the world. And it doesn't to a lot of extents, but it's just adding little points of friction that make things harder. And our job as a service provider is to make things easier in as many ways as we can. So if there are those points of friction that we can't really do anything about, that is just really a stroke against us that we can't control. So while we have worked with clients that are outside of Australia, I think that's why it's less likely. It's just because when people hire a company like us, it's to make their lives easier. And if there are points of friction that make their lives harder, that's just unavoidably bad, right? And those things matter more than you would think. So if there's something that doesn't require constant interaction, yes, theoretically, that's fine. But more things than you think do require a lot of interaction. There are always problems. There are always things to discuss. There are always things that need to be resolved. Those just pop up a lot. And points of friction get in the way. It sucks, but it is what it is. Yeah. To give a more tangible example to that, if we're working with a client who only has the money to hire us for, let's say, 6 weeks, that's what 6 weeks of 5 business days per week is 30 business days. So if there are time zone differences that mean if we send a message and they can't get back to us for a day, how many of those types of messages are we going to send, and how many of those 30 business days might get eaten up just because of time zones? 5? They might lose a week of time just to that. That's kind of, obviously we'd still be working on things in those times, but it's an inefficiency that does actually end up mattering a lot more than you might think it would, especially for small scale projects. They're the types of projects we work on a lot. It can be actually kind of cripplingly bad if you think about the numbers in that way. So you can avoid those things and you can kind of work around them, but they are just unavoidably friction, which, oh well, it is what it is.
Okay. We can move on to the next question, who's also from Ben.
Mhm.
Are you able to offer any advice on how to reach out to government sectors and larger businesses for project proposals when those certain people may have little to no knowledge of what video game or software can be used for?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we don't do a lot of like what I would call cold lead generation. We don't do a lot of approaching people who've never heard of us and trying to pitch them on games. We tried to do that a bit when we were starting out, but found that it just wasn't very useful. I think because of the reason that this question is getting at. I'm a firm believer in games and what games can do for all kinds of businesses. I think that games are very engaging, and that means that if you have something like a piece of educational content you're looking to deliver to people, you can send them a PDF, or if you invest the money in making a game, you're going to send them something that they will want to engage with a bit more actively, and that's incredibly powerful. And so you can work on developing language around that to try and pitch people on things like that. But if somebody isn't interested in games for a lot of different reasons, but the ones you might think of are things like games having a connotation of being childish or whatever, despite despite the average age of Australian gamers being about 40. These connotations or things that mean people aren't interested in games are very hard to overcome, and you're not going to overcome them as somebody who is a complete unknown to somebody. If I approach a client and say, hey, if I cold approach a potential client and say, hey, have you considered using games? Let me, somebody who works in games, sell you on them. They're going to kind of sniff that a little bit funny, right? I think the clients that we've worked with that are outside the games industry have already kind of had the inkling of, okay, I've read some things about how games could be here. Why don't I reach out to some games companies and get more opinions? And that's a very different conversation, because then they're kind of, at least they've shown that they're willing to have that chat, and I can kind of pitch them on what games could do for them. I think IGEA, the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association, do a lot of great work putting out reports that are great data if you need to kind of get somebody to understand that games can be more serious. But there are also a lot of quite successful serious games applications, right? Uses of games, pointing to apps like Duolingo and things like that are doing gamification and are incredibly successful at it, or some of the big game successes like Pokemon Go or things like that. Those are the types of use cases that demonstrate, okay, games can have really serious potential for engaging users, whether that's within games like Pokemon Go or kind of outside of games for things like Duolingo. So yeah, I would kind of encourage you to try and find applicable gamified versions of things that are kind of relevant to the people you're talking about. Point to numbers if you can. If these are kind of business people you're talking about, they love numbers. They love to see something being a success in tangible metrics. So point to that, and then try and point to some of the. Our formula has been, when we're approaching a company that wants to get into games, it's point to something that is specific to their industry, point to something specific that we have done that is kind of relevant and the success metrics behind that. So a project that we haven't. Sorry, I'm getting out of order a bit here. Yeah, so it's first point to something that's specific to their industry. So another game that somebody has worked on doing gamification or something like that has been a success that we can point to. Something specific that we've worked on, so it doesn't necessarily have to be as specific to their industry, but something that we can use to demonstrate, hey, we've worked on this thing and it was a success, and we can do something similar for you. Refer to the previous point. And then the third step is point to what we could work on together that is like the specific application that we would be pitching them on. So whatever the proposal we want to work on with them, point to that. That's a pretty good formula, I think, that helps kind of sell, here's what it could look like, here's what we've done, here's really what it could look like with us together. I think that's a pretty good way to try and get people on board with what making a game for their organization could be.
Does that answer your question, Ben?
Sorry, I think I waffled a little bit, but hopefully I brought it back to something tangible.
I think that's fine then. Okay, so next question is, what entrepreneurial advice can you give to people looking to start their own studios?
That's interesting. I think it's tough to start a studio as your goal as opposed to making a game that you want to make, right? I think I think it's a tough goal to start a studio not tied to a specific game. We kind of did that through the lens of working on client work, and so that would probably be my advice. If you think about if you want to start a studio, or think about if you want to make a game, right? If you want to start a studio, then finance has to be your first consideration. If you want to make a game, then that doesn't have to be your first consideration. That's the strength and also the weakness, I guess, in that you're not focused on earning money immediately. If you're kind of in a stage where you have games that you want to be making and you think you want to turn that into a studio eventually, or you have a team of people working on games together and you want to turn that into a studio eventually, which is probably a situation that people might be in, then I think my advice would be don't worry too much about setting up your organization or registering a business or any of those kind of bits and pieces that are just slightly going to get in the way until you have a successful project. But I would encourage you to have a conversation about when we do have a successful project, what does it look like to turn that into a business? Whether that's like, hey, we're making this project and we want to write down that we will each get a third of the revenue that we put into this game, or maybe we'll each get a fifth and the other 2/5 will go into, you know, funding a business so we can hire contractors or something. Have a plan for what it looks like when you're successful, but don't focus too much on setting up a business and doing share allocations and things like that until you get to that point. I've seen and talked to a lot of people who are almost kind of paralyzed by that. They're worried that there's so many things that could go wrong that they can't kind of get started without setting up a business and talking to an accountant and things like that. And like, yeah, it's good to have knowledge about those things, but they're not going to matter until you're making revenue. So have a plan for them, have something that you've discussed as a team, and ideally something that you've written down and maybe signed so you can point back to it later. But don't stress too much about that yet. That's what I would say. Yeah. There's a question in chat from Sadness, so I'll take a look at that. A few questions, actually. Sorry. So as I said, our studio is 5 people. So how do we distribute our workload across everyone? What's my advice for managing a project? Yeah, so there are 5 of us. How do we distribute our workload? We're typically working on 2 projects at a time. So that means, yeah, the team size is roughly 2 to 3 people on a project. So how do we distribute our workload? I mean, it's based on what the project needs realistically. When we're talking to a client, I'll maybe walk through the process of what it looks like for us to engage a client so that we can kind of get a bit more insight into that. That might be useful. So yeah, a client approaches us typically, or we approach somebody that has posted that they're looking for help with something, or has reached out to our community that they're looking for help with something. We'll reach out to them, we'll have a chat with them for 30, 45 minutes where we just try and understand a bit more what they're looking for. Following that chat, we'll put together a proposal. What that looks like is typically, here's what you've outlined that you need and what we've talked about and how we can help. Here's what the team for that looks like to deliver these specific outcomes that we've listed. Here's what the time frame we think to deliver those, and here's what that cost looks like. If they approve that, or we kind of discuss until they approve that, then we already have here's the people in our head, right? Because if we're proposing here's what we need to do, and here's the team members that are going to do it, we've obviously kind of in our head allocated who's going to be working on a project. It might change. We have a few different programmers, so it might change depending on when we start a project, which programmer is actually working on it. But realistically, we've got the rough allocation in mind already. So then distributing the workload just becomes working on a project that we've kind of done some assessment on and delivering the scope that we've kind of already planned out. If things go poorly or we need to bring in more people, that's fine. We can kind of adjust that as we need to. But yeah, my advice for managing a project is try and stick to a nice, simple, agile framework. I think if you're not familiar, it's worth looking it up. It's a software development framework that I think is pretty useful. I would imagine you're learning it at UTS. It's the kind of thing that I would imagine they would teach, and can be a bit over the top if you're looking at the things that people would prescribe for big software organizations. But at a basic level, what it boils down to is just have a clear list of work that you're working through, have a meeting once a week to plan what you're going to do that week, work through it, kind of chat regularly to flag or raise any problems that come up. And then at the end of the week, look back at the work you've done and adjust the way that you're working to improve your efficiencies. Yeah, I'm definitely a fan of agile development, but I do think that's not to say that you shouldn't plan ahead more than a few sprints. I think you need to kind of do a bit of a blend of agile development for the day-to-day project that you're working on, and then waterfall for the planning of bigger dependencies ahead. Oh, we're working on this thing for the next few months. We've got our next milestone regularly planned out, but then here's the rough high-level plan of the few milestones ahead. But yeah, working on games, they're things that should change based on how fun they are to play, and you don't know that until you develop it. So I wouldn't recommend an entirely waterfall development model, because you're just not going to know if your game's fun enough and if you need to make changes until you're in the thick of it. And making changes while you're in the thick of it is kind of what agile is built around. So yeah. Sorry, I'm jumping across a few questions here. I think that's my rough advice for managing a project. We did do a kind of beginner production guidebook that we released as like blog posts and PDF on our website. We had a few clients that are like 4 to 5 person teams. We've had a few clients that are specifically uni groups that have built their student project, liked it, and kept going and tried and worked on releasing it as a bigger game. And maybe they got funding to do that, maybe they didn't, but we've worked with a few clients like that. And something that is typical for those types of clients is one person has kind of become the producer without really necessarily knowing exactly what that entails. So when we work with clients like that, I come in and do production stuff and try and teach them some production techniques. And so we ended up writing like a series of blog posts and PDFs to sum up some of the basic production things that I would be teaching some of these small teams that had kind of grown a bit bigger than their production experience would typically handle. So check that out. I think it's called Production Basics for Indie Teams. It should be on our website, or I'm just going to try searching that and see if it comes up. Production Basics for Indie Teams. Noble Steed Games. All right, if I search that, oh, it comes up as a talk. That's right, I did it as a talk, and then we did it as an ebook. So yeah, check that out if you want more specific production advice. I did a GCAP talk about it actually, so yeah, you can watch that on YouTube if you want to check it out. I don't necessarily think you need a background in project management before you start a studio. Again, a lot of the things that you should focus on when you're starting your game development journey is make an exciting game, and you can kind of learn the rest of the things later. I think resources like the ebook that I've mentioned or the talk version of it, can be there to help you fill up those gaps. I think the most important thing to focus on for a successful small indie team is let's make some interesting games that we're eager to make. And you can kind of learn that later. Yeah. So the next question from Sadness was, what's the worst and best game pitch you've heard? That's such an interesting question. I won't name names, I guess, for obvious reasons. But the pitches that I hear that are the worst are the ones, which I think I alluded to earlier, that don't really have a lot of detail planned out. Or where you can see they've thought about one thing specifically. Maybe it's like a specific element of the narrative, but they haven't thought about a lot of the other ways that games are going to fit together. I think that's a pretty beginner mistake that I see a lot. And to me, it immediately indicates this person is not really ready for us to work with them, because if we came in and started charging them, there'd be so many questions they would need to go away and come up with answers to that we would just be twiddling our thumbs for a bit, and I don't want to work with somebody that I'm not actively helping. So yeah, that's definitely the worst type of pitch that I hear. The best type of pitch that I hear is, here's our specific deliverables, here's our budget, what can we do together, because they also haven't figured things out, but they at least know that they don't have answers to questions. And it's so exciting to jump into somebody who's eager and kind of knows the rough shape of what they want and how much money they have to do it, but they don't know the specifics, and I can jump in and help them out. I find that fascinating. I think that's a really good opportunity because they're leaving expertise to us, not because they just haven't thought of things, but because they know they have gaps that we can fill in. And I think that's always really exciting. And it's clear when people are kind of self-aware that they have those gaps, and they are kind of smart enough to know, hey, we need help with this, let's go do it, let's kind of make this happen. It's the sign of somebody who's like committed to making their project a reality, which I think is good. So the other question that I saw here from Sadness is, how often do you communicate with the project owner throughout the project? As much as possible. So as I alluded to, we run agile development for our projects, which means we're talking to the product owner is the agile term for it, pretty frequently. At minimum, it's once at the start of the week to talk about what we're going to do, and once at the end of the week to show them what we've done and get them to kind of say, "Yep, that fits what we had in mind." So at minimum, it's for 2 hours per week. Ideally, it's more than that. I think there are often, for the types of projects we work on, our product owners are subject matter experts in things, right? So we're working on a project at the moment with Monash University in Melbourne that is used for, the project is going to be used for like cognitive assessment. And I don't know anything about that. So it's often the type of thing where we know what we're building, but there are specific intricacies of the project that we just don't have the answers to. And so we're going to be chatting to them pretty frequently to uncover those answers. That's for or kind of serious games type applications, but that also applies for game teams that we work with, right? We're coming in to a project, at least some partway through its development, which means we don't have all the context of how things are, why they are the way that they are. We can start coming in and suggesting, hey, have you thought about doing this thing in this reason, in this way for this reason? And they might say, yeah, we have thought about it. We tried it 3 months ago and it kind of worked out, but it didn't work out in the end. So we went with this other solution. By virtue of the way that we work, coming into projects and helping with them, supporting teams that already exist, there are going to be people on those teams that have more answers about why things are the way that they are. So talking to people as much as we can is the goal, right? And again, I would generalize that even further to say, even just being a member of a team, you should be communicating with your other team members pretty actively, because people have different minds, and different minds can come up with different solutions to problems, and sometimes different solutions will be better than the solutions you're coming up with. So yeah, communication, it's like the backbone of success, I think. So yeah, kind of got a bit high level and abstract at the end, but hopefully that at least explains how often we're communicating with project owners and other team members throughout a project. Now I think that's all the questions that were in the chat. I kind of answered the one about background in management before starting a studio already. So yeah, I think we still have some more questions on the list. Is that right, Sam?
Yes, we do. So this one is from Nicholas. We are uni students. Could you tell us more about your own uni and educational experience? What in your personal, educational, and professional life led you into this industry?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll give you my story, I suppose, which is that I was finishing up high school and kind of knew that I wanted to get into games. I had done a bit of programming things on my own. I don't think I had really explored making games at all in high school, though. But I kind of knew that I was interested in games. There weren't really games courses at this point. This was in 2013. Jesus Christ. How do you get so old? I don't know. Anyway, there were some game courses, but none that were really super far along. So I ended up doing a Bachelor of Computer Science at Sydney University, which I did 3 years. That was good. And I kind of, since I knew at that point I wanted to get into games, I started just making my own little game projects. They were terrible. I was using Java, which is not a good language to be developing games in, I don't think. But I did it, so that's good. Yeah, so after I finished uni, I actually, towards the end of my uni time, I got a job doing games with the company that made educational games for the ABC. I think they're called Reading Eggs, was the name of the games. They're like educational games that teach kids from like 4 to 6 or 7, like reading and maths and spelling and stuff. So I was already starting to look for games jobs while I was in uni, and I was lucky enough to get one that was nearby to me, just from being in uni and kind of doing programming stuff. After I finished uni, I ended up, one of the subjects I had in uni was a weird subject where for 6 months we just kind of did a project with a company. So they had a bunch of companies that had kind of partnered with the university and basically got 3 uni students to work for them for free, I guess, for 6 months. And the company that I had done that with ended up hiring us to go and work with them. They were based in California, so I moved to California straight after uni and worked in augmented reality for a year and got very burnt out doing that because it's the tech industry over there is horrible and soul sucking. So I came back home to Sydney and started working again in games, but not what you might think, doing code camp, which if anyone is familiar is like they do holiday and after school programs where they teach kids to program games using like Scratch and kind of simple programming languages. I had kind of been interested in teaching, so I did that. And obviously, and in games, so I did that as a bit of a blend. I didn't make much money, but it was enough to kind of keep me going while I was just like working on my own little games projects. I did that for a while, and then eventually just kind of kept working on my own games and picking up bits and pieces of games contracting work, and then started the studio kind of naturally as we got more and more contracting work, and it kind of grew from there. So it was a journey of all kinds of different things, which I guess speaks to what I was saying before about not necessarily knowing what your path is going to be until it is happening, but being very eager to take opportunities and trying to chase them down. Yeah, I've been very fortunate in that while I was working at Code Camp, I was living with my parents and stuff, and I was whatever like 24 or 23 or 24, um, or earlier, yeah, 23 maybe, which obviously I'm very fortunate to have been able to do. But yeah, I guess just working on a bunch of different things to get into it. So I think that's a bit of my own experience. To apply that to something that's a bit more useful as a takeaway, I suppose. Yeah, like just because you're a uni student doesn't mean you can't be looking for interesting things to be working on, whether that's ideally paid work. I mean, we all want to have jobs in the industry, right? Or as a fallback, just your own projects with your fellow students. You're in a real unique position right now where you have access to a lot of other people who want to get into the industry and will work with you on projects where you're all not paid, right? Because everyone's in a similar position. So you can find good relationships to work on games together. You hear a lot about successful games made by teams of people who started working together around the times that you all are at and just kept doing it because they found a group of collaborators that they really liked. So try and collaborate with people and take opportunities that you can and see where it leads you.
Okay. Next question is from Yana. I think it's the last question from her that was submitted.
Mhm.
What trends do you see shaping the future of indie game developments?
What trends do I see shaping the future of indie game development? That's a hard question. I think we're in a really weird position. Games is in a weird position, I think, where I've, despite the fact that I ended up working in big tech in California, I've never been a big fan of big tech, right? I think um, companies, big tech companies have big valuations that are based on things that they're not necessarily able to do, right? I think there's a lot of easy to point to examples. Let's take Twitter as an example, right? It was sold to Elon Musk for some eye-wateringly huge amount of money, and it wasn't pulling in enough profit to be worth that amount of money. That was all based on some nebulous potential that it wasn't able to realize. And a lot of companies are like that, right? Like Uber, a lot of food delivery companies, a lot of things where hype has let them get a lot more money than they necessarily will be able to realize. And I think I see that tech bubble has applied a bit to games as well, right? I think there are a lot of games that you can point to, Concord maybe being the biggest and most obvious example, that were hype, like from the development or the kind of organizational side, hyped up to deliver some big amount of money that they were never going to be able to realize. And I think that that's a big problem. And I think that the current downturn in the industry is a correction to that problem of big companies realizing they're not going to be able to deliver on these promises that a huge industry theoretically could deliver on, and kind of shutting down or shrinking because of it. I hope that what the future looks like is a return to more artistically crafted experiences as a result, right? I look at like movies as an industry that has gone through something similar of like whatever, like Marvel and big movie fatigue and big box office flops, a lot of them recently, and kind of theaters losing money and stuff like that. And looking at um, distribution companies like A24 that are making movies that people really like and making a name for themselves by making kind of crafted, uh, creative led projects. And I look at that and see that that could be a model that could work and already is kind of working in the games industry for these like smaller to medium sized indie publishers, right? Your Devolvers, or I think Annapurna is maybe an equivalent example because they do films as well as games. So I think the future of indie development, or the trends that I see in indie development, are kind of reassuring. They are more interesting creator led projects being successful. And I think that's good. It's bad in some ways because there aren't like secure jobs where you work on big kind of soulless games, which, not to knock them, they're good places to earn money and build skills, of course. But it's good in the sense that you can make interesting things and there is an appetite for weird, cool, not necessarily big budget, which means they don't have to be polished or super refined, interesting things, right? Things like Lethal Company, I think, is a great example of this. Or Balatro is pretty polished actually, but it's maybe another example. Lethal Company is a great example actually of this like weird little multiplayer indie horror game thing, which is like very creatively made, doesn't have a big budget, kind of, I hate to say it, but doesn't look great at times, and doesn't it has bugs all through it. But that's not a problem to it being a big success. And that's kind of nice to know that you can make games that don't have to be the most polished, they don't have to be big budget, experiences, and they can still be really, really successful if you're smart about what you're making. So I see that being a trend that continues to happen in games, and I think that's great. Um, I see a question from Sadness. A fun name. What's some of your advice for students looking for internships or jobs in a studio? What to put in a portfolio or CV? What to put in a portfolio or CV? Yeah, to bring us back to something that I said earlier, like have more things in your portfolio, more projects. The more projects you've made that are like out there and kind of cool, the better. So make more things, put them up on itch. Ideally things that are like able to be played in the web browser. That's so nice. I kind of hate to say this, but if your CV is full of projects that I have to download to play, I'll play like one of them. Whereas if your CV is full of projects that are on the web, I could play like three or four of them just because it's a barrier to entry. And if I'm hiring for a role, I'm looking through 30, 40, whatever CVs. And the fewer barriers to entry you have for me to spend more time with you, the better. So make things, put them up on itch. The more things you make, the better it reflects on you. Of course, you want those things to be good too. If you make something that's really high quality and then a bunch of other stuff that's not as high quality, I think that's a good blend. You have something that kind of knocks my socks off, and then there'll be a bunch of other stuff so I can say, yeah, you've made other things too, and you're out there, you're making things. So yeah, that's my advice. Just make things. Yeah, as I said, you're really lucky to be in a position where you have a lot of people around you that want to work on games with you. For free. None of you are going to get paid, so kind of leverage that time and make some games. Yeah, I think. Sorry, when I say none of you are going to get paid, I don't mean you're not going to find work. I mean you're surrounded by people that are willing to work on games to build experience. So leverage that and do that. Um, what do you think are some underrated from Chanel? What do you think are some underrated skills for someone wanting to break into the games industry? Underrated skills. That's such an interesting question. I don't know that I think any skills are necessarily underrated. I think there are some skills that are overrated, which I guess means the other skills are underrated. So what's underrated? I think like um hmm I guess it depends on the places that you're potentially looking to work, I suppose. So for myself, because we're a small studio, we work on a lot of different types of projects. I mean, you've probably noticed my advice is around working on a lot of different types of things. And to step outside of my own shoes for a second, maybe that is a bit biased by the fact that I do work on a lot of different types of projects. So I want people who have the flexibility to work on a lot of different types of things. I would encourage you to look at the types, look at the people whose career paths you want to emulate, or everyone's path is different in games, but whose career endpoints you want to emulate, and look at what skills they have and try and build up those skills. Look at the specific people that you want to be more like and see if you can develop skills similar to them, because that will obviously help you along to get there. In terms of underrated skills, I think it's good to not put yourself too much in a box. And I don't think this is just my own bias as saying this, but in a lot of games teams, especially in Australia where games teams are small, you do want to have a breadth of skills, or you don't necessarily want to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, but you do want to have the ability to say, yep, I'm a programmer, but I also know enough about shaders and technical art to do that stuff. Or I'm a programmer, but I can also do some narrative design or some production or something, right? It just makes you more appealing, is the realistic side of it, demonstrating you've got a core competency that you're good at, but you do also have some other things you can help out with, because there's always need for more hats in the team. So yeah, I haven't really named any specific underrated skills. So let me see. None really jump out to me as being especially underrated though. So yeah, I think just like, yeah, building some skills outside of your main competency is always good. And I don't think there really are any skills that are like super underrated necessarily, other than just like programming and art. I mean, I hate to say it, they're the two big ones. The better you can do with those, the better, I think. So yeah. A question from Stephen. What decides whether or not I should find a publisher? Yeah, it's interesting. I think there are I think a lot of game development teams have the goal of working on a game, get it to a point where we can do a vertical slice or a demo, and then find a publisher that will help us fund it to do it more. And that's like that's a lot of teams are trying to do that exact model, and that means it's very competitive. It's not the only model necessarily, right? It is one of the clearest models to being funded to work on a game, but it's not the only one. Crowdfunding is, of course, another model where you can work on something, get some engagement from a community, and then build out the game with them. Or a kind of alternate version of that, I guess, is something like early access, where you're building a community that are interested in your game and kind of monetizing that community early to continue to fund your development of the game, I suppose. So the question of whether or not you should find a publisher, I think, is partially determined by how much do you have, the energy to work on a game. Do you need to be funded to continue to work on a game? Because obviously, if you're not funded, you need to be bringing in money from somewhere else, potentially needing to work a job, maybe a job outside of games to give you the opportunity to keep working on your game. If that's the case, you might really be desperate to try and find a publisher, but there are other options for funding that are worth considering. They all come with their own drawbacks. The drawback of finding a publisher is it's very competitive. The drawback of a Kickstarter or early access is you have to put in a lot of time into marketing for a Kickstarter and like community management, I guess you would call it, in addition to marketing for an early access game. So there are like drawbacks, but drawbacks are also kind of different strengths, right? If you're not as good at networking, you might not want to go down the publisher publisher, what am I trying to say? The publisher road. You might want to, if you're better at community management and or marketing, you might want to go down a different angle instead. But yeah, I guess that's what I would think through. What decides whether or not I should find a publisher? It's how much do you need money, and what are the skills that you might leverage or the path you might take to get money to continue developing, I suppose.
Okay. Next question is also from Stephen. How do you see the future of multiplayer and online gaming for indie developers?
Yeah. Online multiplayer is getting easier and easier and easier to do for indie developers, which is great. I think it's part of the general kind of democratization of game development, which I think is fantastic, right? You used to need to know how to program fucking basic or something to make games, and you obviously don't need to, or machine language, I guess, originally to make games, and you don't need to do that anymore. You can use engines like Unity, or if you're not a programmer at all, you can use like visual tools or like narrative building engines like Ink or things like that. Game development has become more and more democratized, and more parts of game development are following that trend. So online multiplayer, there are now a lot of libraries that you can use that make things a lot simpler. We use a lot of Photon Fusion at at the studio. That's one that I'm a big fan of. It makes game development, multiplayer game development, a lot simpler. Having said that, multiplayer game development is tough, right? Especially if you're new to programming. There's a lot of intricacies about how it works that are kind of complex. If you're getting started on multiplayer and you've never done it before, definitely set your focus with a game that can be peer-to-peer as opposed to requiring servers. So steer clear of MMOs, definitely. And I say that as a huge hypocrite because I've worked on some of my own hobby project MMOs before, but they're rough. Server costs are expensive. So try and stick to things that can be peer-to-peer as much as possible, which means basically things that it doesn't matter too much if your friends try and cheat. Or sorry, if the other players try and cheat, because you basically be playing with your friends. And if you cheat when you're playing with your friends, you get punched. So you don't have to worry about complex infrastructure to prevent that, I guess. So yeah, that would be my advice in general for getting into it. But in terms of like wider trends, yeah, multiplayer development is getting easier and easier and cheaper. So that's good. I think we'll see lots more interesting little multiplayer games. Peer-to-peer type games like something like Lethal Company, I think are great examples of that as well. That I'm really hyping up Lethal Company, but it is just a great success story of recent years, so it's useful, I suppose. But there are other ones. There are, of course, a lot of different types of games that have become kind of interesting little multiplayer games for people to play together, and I think that's fantastic. So yeah, I think we'll continue to see as the democratization of game development continues, more and more types of games being easier and easier to make, which is great.
Yeah, I think the next question for myself, what does a typical 9 to 5 look like for you?
What does a typical 9 to 5 look like for me? It changes based on the projects that I'm working on or the team is working on. But for a typical day, it would be start work around 8:30 or 9. Usually doing some morning stand-ups, one or two before about 11 o'clock. So I typically have about an hour in meetings before my first 2 hours of the day. Kind of smash through a few tasks early on, spend the middle part of the day kind of just smashing through work. I'm typically allocated to projects as a programmer or as a producer. So I'll be smashing through a bunch of tasks in the first half of the day. Then there'll typically be meetings again coming in around 2 to 5. So I'll usually get back into meetings then. I typically try and wrap up my day around like 4 to 4:30 to go and do other tasks and then come back to do things like respond to emails or administrative type work in the evenings, like just grab my laptop and respond to some emails or something. I find that a better way for me to work. So that's pretty typical for what it would look like for me. Depending on the day as well, we'll typically have like, sprint planning meetings on a Monday and review meetings in the afternoon on a Friday. We'll have things like team chill hour, we call it, where the whole team gets together and we kind of play a game or something together for an hour once every fortnight just to kind of connect, especially if people are working on different projects. It can be good to reconnect with the team if they're not on the same project as you. But yeah, I guess that's my typical 9 to 5 is some meetings, desperately trying to scrounge out some time to smash through some actual cards and bugs and tasks and things, more meetings, and then some emails and stuff thrown on top. So Nick has jumped in to add on to that one and said, adding to this, what strategies do you use to stay organized and motivated? I don't know. This is one that I think has to change from person to person. I myself am pretty rigorous about doing a lot of like task lists and building my to-do list pretty rigorously at the start of the day or in advance, so that I know on a given day, here's the 10 things I need to get through. Trying to remember what the most important ones are, so I can, I've got 10 things to get through. 2 of those emails that can wait until tomorrow if they have to, and the rest are things that I really want to do today. And here's the prime thing that I really want to spend most of my day on, right? So I'm a big fan of to-do lists, again, just because that's what I use to stay organized and motivated. I'm also a fan of having I use a Kanban board for my day-to-day life as well as my work life. Like a Trello board of tasks where I can just be like, oh, yep, I need to, whatever, clean out the fridge every 7 days. And I've got a repeating card that does that for me, because otherwise I just forget things. So that I use that to stay organized. In terms of motivated, that's harder. I think doing things like trying to make time for a proper lunch in the middle of the day to give myself a break, and some of those types of things that I try and do. I don't necessarily always do, because sometimes things get in the way, of course, but those are the types of things I use to stay motivated. Trying to find time to work on my own hobby projects as well outside of work. I'll often try and put in time after hours to just work on things that are interesting to me, that aren't like work projects. So that kind of keeps me motivated as well, I suppose. Yeah. Stephen has asked, what's your favorite game? That's a tough one, because it changes a lot. I'm really into puzzle games at the moment. I played a game called The Root Trees Are Dead, which I thought was fantastic. If anyone's played like Obra Dinn, it's kind of that vibe of like deductive game, which is really appealing to me at the moment. So that's my favorite game that I've played recently. The Root Trees Are Dead, really good. Would recommend. It's like a deductive genealogy game. It's fantastic. I played UFO 50 recently. That was really good as well. A very good indie game, like an indie hero kind of game. The kind of game that I look at and I go like, man, I wish I could be an indie developer that could make a game like that. Some of those games where you're just like, shit, that person made a really cool thing. So that was good too, UFO 50. Yeah, I don't know. Those are some of my favorite games at the moment, at least, but it does change a lot. How do you determine what software, game engines, libraries to use for different projects? In terms, well, before I say that, I guess, if a client has a specific requirement, we'll have to work around that, of course. Often they don't, though, and we'll make recommendations. For engines, we use Unity for like 85% of our work, with the other 15% being like web-based development engines. So like either JavaScript or a more specific web engine library for the project that we use. But most of the time it's Unity, because that's what we're familiar with. That's what we've got experience with. So we would basically always recommend Unity if someone wants to work with us, because we'll just be more efficient within it. Speaking to libraries, it's really dependent on technical limitations. So sometimes it's platform based. There are libraries that might not work with a specific platform, or somebody's got a specific plugin they're using for development which requires a specific version of Unity, and we might need to work around that. But other than that, I think if there's no specific technical reasons to choose one library over another, the other reasons that I would usually consider are experience. If we've got an experience with the library, that means we can just use it quicker, and that's good. Or a good thing to often check is a level of support that a library has. So one of the reasons we started using Photon for networking so much was it had an active community, and they were very responsive to queries on there. They've become a bit less so as they've gotten bigger, but that's what we would look at before picking a library often, because if you don't know about something, you're going to run into problems, and the speed at which you can solve those problems is sometimes the speed at which someone responds to you from the development team with specific help to queries, right? So yeah, looking at the amount of support, or how active the developer of a plugin is in responding to, or library is in responding to queries, is one of the biggest factors. If we have no kind of specific plugin or library that's applicable based on our experience already, that's what I would look at. Project feasibility aside, are there cases where you reject projects entirely based off of what type of content will be in the game? Not really. I think for any project that we work on as a team, if there's like things that I think team members might be sensitive to, I will just ask them, "Are you interested in working on this project or not?" And of course, they can say no. Um, there are some types of projects that some types of team members aren't interested in, but for myself, there's nothing that I would really openly reject. I mean, I guess there's probably some types of games that haven't approached us to work on them, so we haven't had to consider that. Um, I think if we were approached by, I don't know, like a Rupert Murdoch to make a game with him, I might have some ethical obligations or something, but he hasn't approached us yet, so I haven't actually crossed that bridge. So it hasn't really been a big problem. I kind of pretty firmly believe that everyone who is trying to make something that they find interesting and they're passionate about deserves help, deserves qualified help. So I don't think I would, if somebody's trying to do something for a good reason, I don't think I would reject them regardless of content, I suppose. If something's working on something that they find personally fascinating and interesting, it'd be pretty tough for me to disqualify it for content reasons if they really need our help. So yeah. Do you think Godot will grow to be adopted more in the industry? We have quite a few Godot enjoyers here in the society. I hope so. I really do hope so. I think it's not there yet. And there are some specific problems that it will have to overcome. One that immediately jumps out to me as we're a studio that does porting work is obviously Godot is open source, and a lot of the platform SDKs are very strict about who can access the documentation for them, so they can't be open sourced, which means that Godot can't natively support porting platforms. They kind of, I think the way that it works, or the way that it worked when I last looked at it, was you kind of need to go through one of the big kind of license providers that are kind of Godot service providers that can have built their tools in-house, closed source tools to port games, which is fine, but it's not as kind of democratized as Unity, where once you're approved to get on the PlayStation Store or whatever, you can connect your Unity account, and then Unity just unlocks the ability to publish to PlayStation. That is really nice, and it's really clean, and it doesn't require you to pay anyone any money, which means that it's a lot more open for indie developers. So Godot I think is great. I really do love Godot, and I've done some games myself with it, but there are some specific issues because it's open source that come up that actively prevent indie developers from getting on board with it. But I do hope it will get adopted more. I know there are a lot of indie developers that do use Godot, and I think that is fantastic. I think open source is a great thing to exist. So yeah, I hope so, and I think the more people use it, the better and better it's going to be. I think it will be and continue to be successful just based off the simple fact that any company that is a capitalist kind of driven or share driven company will inevitably eat itself, because they will prioritize profit above slowly but surely they'll prioritize profit above the needs of their users and their developers. I mean, we can all point to examples of Unity doing that, because Unity is traded as a stock. So it's just inevitable that will happen. And Godot being open source is more resilient to that. In fact, somewhat impervious to that, which means that over time it'll win if it can stay the distance. So, yeah, I hope so, and I think so.
Okay. I believe next question is from Nicholas. Gen AI is affecting everyone's lives and work in numerous ways. Is it affecting your own line of work? If not, how do you expect it to?
Is it affecting my own line of work? Not yet. I think it will. Well, maybe I'm being naive in saying not yet. There is a type of client that approaches us that is people who are outside of games and kind of see themselves wanting to get into games and not knowing where to start, and reaching out to us to supply them with a game that they're looking to build, right? And maybe there's a world where if Gen AI gets better, or maybe they're doing this now, they will just try and go to ChatGPT or Sora or whatever and say, hey, generate me some images over there, generate me some code over there, and they'll try and plug it together. The reason I say that I don't think is impacting our our work as a studio yet is because there is already a version of that which is outsourcing, and people have been doing that for ages, and they still need us because uh, when you outsource code to very cheap developers or very cheap artists, you get what you paid for, which is good to build a cheap prototype, but can't really sustain a bigger game that you need to develop. Um, so we've had a lot of people come to us because they have built a prototype or an early version of a game by outsourcing it, and they've needed us to kind of rescue it a bit and steer the ship. And I think there's probably a similar situation that can happen with generative AI, at least in the short term, where they've developed something using generative AI and it's just not doing it well. So I don't think it's really affecting our work yet. How do I expect it to? I don't know. I'm kind of not necessarily sold that we'll ever get good enough to do that. I think the core problem of like if people use generative AI more and more, it will eventually just kind of eat its own tail by act of like not having enough new things to create, and that will just lead to worse AI. So I think this is kind of like fundamental problem with generative AI that I'm not sure it will ever overcome. Not to mention all the other problems like people want things that other humans have created as opposed to things that a robot has created that they can't kind of point to. So I don't know. I don't know. I think the way that it will realistically affect my work is there will become better and better AI tooling for developers to use. I think the the IDE that I use to write C# for game development, already uses some AI auto-filling suggestions, and I use that all the time. I just like press tab, and it, I start typing something. I go like, I'm setting up a constructor for a class, and it's like got int x, int y, int width, int height, and I'll just start typing, and it'll be like, oh, set width to width, set height to height. Like, oh, great, hit tab, it knows to do that. I think that's the thing that will continue to happen. That's the programmer equivalent, but there's probably an artist equivalent too that I'm not as experienced with Photoshop to know, using generative AI to perform fills or kind of help with repetitive tasks of, hey, I need to kind of adjust the lines here or things like that. I'd imagine that will happen. There'll be AI tooling that will make life more efficient. I don't necessarily think that generative AI will ever fully replace uh, human efforts because I just think people don't want that, and I don't think it will ever be good enough to fully do that. Yeah. You're welcome, Nick.
Hey, I believe we've hit the end of all the submitted questions, so does anyone in the audience have more questions they'd like to ask?
Yeah, God, what a cop out it is to have AI potentially doing the creative work. That's not what we're sold on. We do the creative work, they do the boring shit. That's fine. Yeah, I don't know. I hope we one day get to an AI utopia where we all have a universal basic income and don't have to do any of the work we don't want to do, but who knows? There's a long way to go before we get to that, I suppose. Uh, Yana, how do you keep up with current events / news in the games industry or tech industry? Is there a site? Oh gosh, I mean, I feel like I don't keep up that well, to be honest. I think my general way that I get any kind of news, game industry or non-game industry, is either through social media like Blue Sky, people that I like posting about it, me finding it out that way, something equivalent like a YouTuber that I follow posting about it, or it comes across a subreddit and I go through it there. I'm not super subscribed to any like games journalism sites, but there is Games Hub, which is good in Australia. They do a lot of stuff. I do kind of. I'm following them on Blue Sky, so I get articles across my feed from that. So yeah, that'd be good. Oh, sorry. The events though is a bit different, I suppose. That's what I would talk about for news. Sorry, current events as news. That's what I think. In terms of events, yeah, I think there aren't that many games events being put on in Sydney. So just following the specific people that are putting it on. So that's us, I guess. Like Serenade is involved with a lot of events in Sydney. Waypoint. kind of like volunteer run organizations like that. Powerhouse is doing a few now. So just kind of following the specific people that put those on. I think, yeah, being in some specific Sydney based groups like Discord groups or Facebook groups, like IGDA Sydney will often post about events. There's like a few other games groups in Sydney as well. But those types of things are probably the place to go if you're looking for like games events around Sydney and Australia. Yeah. Chanel has said, "Who are some of the people that helped you most in your career?" That's so interesting. I think, yeah, I have built some connections with other studio leaders in Australia that have been very helpful from a perspective of just kind of being involved in the industry. But because we're a service providing company, I think the people that have helped me the most are like some of the team members that have joined me and kind of done some really great work for me and continue to do great work for me slash with me. So yeah, I haven't necessarily felt that there's been anyone like I don't have a mentor in the games industry or anything. I know there are groups out there to help people find mentors and those types of things, but I've just never engaged with that too much. Um, but yeah, I like take inspiration from a lot of different people in the industry, and I think the thing that is the most helpful has been the most helpful to me is just being connected to the wider Australian games industry. People that I've met at like GCAP and PAX in Melbourne, and who still recognise me even though we met 10 years ago, and that's very nice. I think the games industry in Australia is very friendly, and that's fantastic. So yeah, get involved, say hi to people, all that jazz. Yeah. Any other questions?
I guess that's everything then.
I guess not. Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess we could end the talk here, unless anyone has anything final. Sadness is
Um,
typing. Oh, no, never mind.
no. I'll say if anyone's, I've been very much obsessed with puzzle games lately. So I recommended the Root Trees Are Dead earlier. If anyone's into any like paper puzzles, like print and solve puzzles, this is one that I made pretty recently. So check it out if you want. That's my little plug. But other than that, it's been great. Thank you. These are all very interesting and good questions. So hopefully I've been helpful. And if anyone wants to, feel free to um, reach out to me. I'll drop my email actually in chat as well. In case anyone has any further questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, I'm always happy to answer more questions or chat more. So
All right, thank you very much for your time. It's been very insightful, and
no worries.
yeah, I appreciate all the questions that you've been answering.
No worries. Hope everyone has a good rest of their week.
All right, you too. Thank you very much.
See you, folks.